The phone rang at 2:47 p.m. on September 4th, 1976. Dean Martin was in his den, watching a golf tournament with the sound turned low, not really paying attention. He'd been doing a lot of that lately, sitting in rooms, staring at screens, letting time pass without marking it. He almost didn't answer. He almost never answered anymore. But something made him reach for the receiver. "Dean." It was Frank Sinatra's voice. "I need a favor." Dean sighed. Frank's favors were never simple. They always involved showing up somewhere, performing something, being Dean Martin when all Dean wanted was to be left alone. "What kind of favor?" "Jerry's doing his telethon tonight. The MDA thing." Dean's hand tightened on the receiver. Jerry. He hadn't heard that name spoken directly to him in years. People knew better than to bring up Jerry Lewis around Dean Martin. So I'm going on, to help with the fundraising, and I want you to come with me." Dean laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're out of your mind." "Maybe, but I'm asking anyway. Frank, Jerry and I haven't spoken in 20 years. 20 years. You know that. I know that. The whole world knows that. That's exactly why you need to come." Dean was quiet for a moment. Through the window he could see the afternoon sun slanting across his lawn, painting everything in shades of gold. It was beautiful. It was meaningless. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why now? Why after all this time?" Frank's voice softened. "Because life's too short for grudges, Doug. Because you're both getting old. Because somewhere underneath all the bullshit, you still love that kid. And he still loves you. You don't know that." "Yeah, I do. I've seen him talk about you when he thinks nobody's listening. The pain in his eyes, Dean. It's the same pain I see in yours." Dean closed his eyes. Memories flooded in. Memories he'd spent 2 decades trying to drown. Jerry's laugh. Jerry's energy. The way they'd finished each other's sentences on stage. The way they'd built an empire out of nothing but chemistry and timing and something that felt for a while like brotherhood. And then the memories turned darker. The arguments. The resentment. The slow poison of success that had turned 2 best friends into strangers, then enemies, then ghosts that haunted each other's lives without ever speaking. "I can't," Dean said quietly. "You can. You're just scared." "I'm not scared. I just don't see the point." "The point is closure, Dean. The point is not dying with this thing unfinished." Frank paused. "You want to spend whatever years you've got left carrying this weight? Or do you want to put it down?" Dean didn't answer. He couldn't. "I'll pick you up at 7, Frank said. "Wear something nice." The line went dead. Dean sat there for a long time, holding the silent receiver, staring at nothing. 20 years. Half a lifetime. A friendship that had burned so bright it had blinded them both, and then burned out so completely that neither of them could find their way back to each other in the darkness. He should call Frank back. He should say no. He should stay in this house, in this chair, in this careful isolation he'd built around himself. But he didn't. At 7 o'clock, when Frank's car pulled up outside, Dean Martin was waiting. The MDA Labor Day Telethon was the biggest annual fundraising event in America. For over a decade, Jerry Lewis had hosted it, a grueling, emotional marathon that ran for nearly 24 hours straight. Jerry begged, pleaded, cried, and performed, raising millions of dollars for muscular dystrophy research. It was his passion, his purpose, the thing that gave his life meaning after the comedy had faded and the movies had stopped. By September 4th, 1976, Jerry was exhausted. He'd been on the air for nearly 18 hours, running on coffee and adrenaline and sheer willpower. His voice was hoarse. His eyes were red. But he kept going, because that's what Jerry Lewis did. He kept going until there was nothing left. The Sahara Hotel showroom was packed with celebrities who had come to perform and donate. Sammy Davis Jr. had sung. Dionne Warwick had performed. Tony Orlando had brought the house down. But the night was winding down, and Jerry was visibly struggling to maintain his energy. Then Frank Sinatra walked onto the stage. The audience erupted. Frank Sinatra was the biggest star in the world, and his appearance on the telethon was always a highlight. He embraced Jerry, said some kind words about the cause, and pledged a generous donation. But something was different about Frank tonight. There was a glint in his eye, a barely suppressed smile that suggested he knew something the audience didn't. "Jerry," Frank said, putting his arm around his old friend, "I've got a surprise for you." Jerry looked confused. "A surprise?" "Frank, I'm too tired for surprises. Trust me, you're going to want to see this one." Frank turned toward the wings of the stage and gestured. The audience followed his gaze, curious, expectant. And then Dean Martin walked out. The gasp from the audience was audible. 2,000 people inhaled at the same time, creating a sound like a sudden wind. Dean Martin was walking toward Jerry Lewis. After 20 years of silence, after 20 years of questions and speculation and tabloid rumors, after 20 years of one of the most famous breakups in entertainment history. Jerry's face was a mask of shock. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes, those expressive eyes that had made millions laugh and cry, filled with tears instantly. Dean walked across the stage with his usual casual grace, but those who knew him could see the tension in his shoulders, the uncertainty in his step. This was uncharted territory. This was the moment he'd been avoiding for 2 decades. He reached Jerry. They stood face to face, 2 men in their late 50s who had once been inseparable, who had once been the biggest act in show business, who had once loved each other like brothers. The silence stretched on. The audience held its breath. Millions of viewers at home leaned toward their television screens. And then Dean Martin spoke. "I think it's about time, don't you?" 6 words. That's all it took. 6 words, and 20 years of pain and anger and regret came crashing down. Jerry Lewis burst into tears. Not the performative tears of a showman, but the raw, ugly tears of a man whose heart was breaking and healing at the same time. He grabbed Dean and pulled him into an embrace so fierce that both men nearly lost their balance. The audience exploded. Standing ovation, cheering, crying. People who had grown up watching Martin and Lewis, who had mourned their breakup, who had wondered if they would ever reconcile. They were witnessing something miraculous. They were witnessing resurrection. Dean held Jerry for a long moment, his own eyes glistening, his mask of cool finally cracking after all these years. When they pulled apart, both men were laughing through their tears. "You son of a bitch," Jerry said, his voice breaking. 20 years. I know. 20 years I waited for you to call. I know. I'm sorry." Jerry shook his head, wiping his eyes. "I'm sorry too. I'm so sorry, Dean. We were both stubborn idiots. We were. We really were." Frank Sinatra stood off to the side, watching his 2 friends with a satisfied smile. This was his doing. This was his gift to both of them. After years of watching them suffer separately, he'd finally found a way to bring them back together. The audience wouldn't stop applauding. The moment stretched on, electric and emotional and utterly unscripted. This wasn't television. This was life, happening in real time, in front of millions of witnesses. Finally, Jerry grabbed the microphone. His showman's instincts were kicking back in, even through the tears. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice shaking, "I want you to meet my friend, my partner, my brother, Dean Martin." The applause redoubled. Dean smiled, that famous lazy smile, but there was something different about it tonight. Something genuine. Something vulnerable. "It's good to be here, Jer," Dean said softly, not really playing to the audience, just talking to Jerry. "It's really good. You want to sing something? For old time's sake?" Dean hesitated. He hadn't sung with Jerry in 20 years. They hadn't performed together since July 25, 1956, the night of their last show at the Copacabana, the night their partnership had officially ended. "Come on," Jerry urged. "Just one song. For the kids." Dean looked at his old partner. The years had changed them both. Jerry's hair was gray. Dean's face was lined. They weren't the young, hungry performers who had taken the world by storm anymore. They were survivors of a war that neither of them had ever really won. But somewhere underneath all the years, all the pain, all the silence, they were still Martin and Lewis. They were still the two kids who had met at the Glass Hat Club in 1945 and recognized something in each other that nobody else could see. "All right," Dean said finally. "One song." The band started playing. It was their old signature tune, "That's Amore." Dean began to sing, his voice still smooth and warm despite the years. And Jerry, true to form, began to clown around, mugging for the camera, pretending to swoon at Dean's voice. For 3 minutes it was 1950 again. For 3 minutes Martin and Lewis were back, the greatest comedy team in history, doing what they did better than anyone else on earth. The audience laughed and cried simultaneously. At home, millions of viewers did the same. When the song ended, Jerry and Dean embraced again. This time the hug lasted longer. This time they both knew it might be the last time they ever performed together. "I love you, Dean," Jerry whispered, low enough that the microphones couldn't pick it up. "I love you too, Jer. I always did. Even when I hated you." They pulled apart, both laughing at the absurdity of it all. 20 years of silence, erased in 10 minutes. 20 years of pain, healed by 6 words. After the telethon ended, Dean and Jerry sat together in a quiet corner of the Sahara Hotel. The cameras were gone. The audiences had dispersed. It was just the two of them, two old men trying to find their way back to a friendship that had once defined their lives. "Why didn't you ever call?" Jerry asked quietly. Dean considered the question carefully. He'd asked himself the same thing 1,000 times. "Pride," he admitted. "Stupid, useless pride. I kept thinking you should be the one to reach out first. You were the one who wanted out." Jerry shook his head. "That's not true. You were the one pulling away. You were the one who wanted to be a solo act. Because you made me feel invisible. Every interview, every article, it was always about Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis the genius. Jerry Lewis the visionary. I was just the guy who stood there and sang while you got all the glory. That's not—" Jerry stopped. His face crumpled. "Was that really how you felt?" "That's how it was, Jer. Maybe you didn't see it, but I did. Every goddamn day I saw it." Jerry was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was jealous of you." Dean stared at him. "What?" "I was jealous. Every night you'd walk on stage and women would swoon. You had this effortless cool, this natural charisma. People loved you without you even trying. I had to work so hard to get a fraction of that love. I had to be louder, crazier, more desperate." Jerry laughed bitterly. "I was jealous of you, Dean, and I handled it badly." Dean didn't know what to say. For 20 years he'd nursed his grievances, convinced that Jerry had been the villain in their story. Now Jerry was telling him that he'd felt the same way, that they'd both been wounded, both been jealous, both been too proud to admit it. "We were idiots," Dean said finally. "Complete idiots. We wasted 20 years. Yeah, we did." They sat in silence, absorbing the weight of all that lost time. All the birthdays they hadn't shared, all the phone calls they hadn't made, all the moments, good and bad, that they'd experienced alone instead of together. "You know what I missed most?" Jerry said. "What?" "Making you laugh. When we were young, before everything got complicated. I could always make you laugh. That real laugh, not the one you did for audiences. The one that came from somewhere deep." Jerry's eyes grew distant. "I haven't heard that laugh in 20 years. Dean felt something crack inside him. All the walls he'd built, all the defenses he'd constructed, they were crumbling. And underneath, there was just a man who had lost his best friend and spent 2 decades pretending he didn't care. "You want to hear it now?" Dean asked. "Yeah, I really do." Dean leaned back in his chair and looked at his old partner. This ridiculous, brilliant, infuriating man who had driven him crazy and made him a star, and then broken his heart. "Remember the time in Detroit?" Dean said. "When you put the live chicken in my dressing room?" Jerry's face lit up. "And you chased it down the hallway in your underwear? And the hotel manager came around the corner right when I caught it? And you told him you were rehearsing for a new act called Martin and the Chicken?" Dean started to laugh. Really laugh. The deep, genuine laugh that Jerry had been missing for 20 years. Jerry started laughing too, and soon they were both doubled over, tears streaming down their faces, laughing at a memory that was older than some of the people who had watched them on the telethon tonight. "God, we had fun," Dean said when he could breathe again. "The best fun. The best years of my life. Mine too, Jer. Even when I couldn't admit it." Jerry reached out and took Dean's hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they'd been through. The triumph and the tragedy, the love and the hatred, the silence, and finally, the reconciliation. "I don't want to waste any more time," Jerry said. "Whatever years we've got left, I don't want to spend them being strangers." Dean nodded slowly. "Neither do I." "So we start over? Friends again?" Dean smiled. That real smile, the one that almost nobody got to see anymore. "We were never not friends, Jer. We were just too dumb to remember it." They sat together until the sun came up over Las Vegas, two old partners telling stories, filling in the gaps of 20 years, finding their way back to each other one memory at a time. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. The years apart had changed them both too much for that. They would never work together again, never recapture the magic of their prime. But they would talk on the phone occasionally. They would send Christmas cards. They would acknowledge in their own quiet ways that the connection between them had never really been broken, just buried under layers of pride and pain. When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995, Jerry Lewis wept. He wept for the partner he had loved, the friend he had lost, and the 20 years they had wasted before that night at the telethon. "Dean was my brother," Jerry said in an interview years later. "Not by blood, but by something deeper. We had something that doesn't come along very often, this perfect chemistry, this ability to make magic together. And we almost threw it away forever." He paused, wiping his eyes. "But we got those last years. We got to say the things we needed to say. We got to forgive each other. And that night at the telethon, when he walked out on that stage and said, 'I think it's about time, don't you?' That was the greatest moment of my life." The interviewer pressed him. "What do you think he meant by that? It's about time?" Jerry smiled through his tears. He meant it was time to stop being afraid. Time to stop hiding behind pride and anger and all the bullshit we use to protect ourselves from being hurt. Time to admit that we needed each other, that we had always needed each other. He paused. Dean didn't talk much. He wasn't one for big speeches or emotional declarations. But that night, in 6 words, he said everything. Do you think he ever regretted the 20 years of silence? I know he did. And so do I. Every day I wish we'd been braver. I wish we'd put down our weapons sooner. Jerry shook his head. But we can't change the past. We can only be grateful for what we got in the end. He looked directly at the camera. If you've got someone in your life that you've lost touch with, a friend, a family member, anyone, don't wait. Don't let pride win. Life is too short and too precious to waste on grudges. Jerry Lewis died in 2017, 22 years after Dean Martin. In his final years, he kept a photograph on his desk. A picture from that night at the telethon, the moment when Dean walked out on stage and changed everything. 2 men embracing, 2 friends reunited, 2 stubborn idiots who finally found their way back to each other. On the back of the photograph, in Jerry's handwriting, were 6 words. I think it's about time.